We're joined tonight by Dermot O'Brien. He is a Wicklow County Councillor and he's been elected in Wicklow in 2019 and then re-elected in 2024, and he's currently the Cathaoirleach of Bray as well. And he has a lot of experience with the SPCs as well as with community education and training and youth participation. So we're delighted to have him here, and I'll pass you over to him now. Take it away, Dermot.
Thank you very much, Catherine. How's it going, everyone? I was going to preface by saying I've just spent 3.5 hours at a full council meeting in Wicklow, but then that might kind of downgrade your expectations of me. But I'm really happy to be here, and I still have enough energy in the tank to contribute this evening. And it was actually a very curious invitation when Catherine contacted me and shared that these things are a regular feature, trying to build the scaffolding of support for PPN reps who are sitting on SPCs. And it was a really interesting angle to say, can we bring in a sitting councillor to maybe add a bit of flavour to the capacity building, or bring a bit of maybe insight, or maybe some tips and advice about how to maximise the impact or the potential for PPN reps in SPCs. So I'm going to share a little bit about who I am, where I'm coming from, and hopefully give you a context to me that might make it interesting to consume the content that I'm going to share and get some of the perspectives that I bring. And then I've got some reflections to just share with you about what it's been like for me as an elected rep to be sharing a space in an SPC with PPN reps. And I'm going to even share some of the best case scenarios that I've come across and worst case scenarios that I've come across, and perhaps as well to give you some tips about how to navigate that space in a way that honors what you do bring and what you're trying to bring. So I'm going to share. I've only got 3 slides in terms of just my intro to just give you a sense of who I am, and then bring us into the chat that I'm going to share. So hopefully you can see that. So first and foremost, then you will see that I have a nickname. So maybe that's good for my branding or not, but I am known as Daisy, and I'm Dermot Daisy O'Brien. But Daisy is a nickname that I've had since I was about 14 years of age, and it has traveled with me in my life, mostly through youth work and community spaces. And it's a lovely kind of takes the edge off for a councillor to carry a nickname like Daisy. So I'm quite fond of it, even though at times people hear about Daisy and they picture a woman in their mind, and then they meet Daisy and they realize I have to reframe any thoughts I might have had about who Daisy is. So just to give you a sense of who I am in the broad sense. So, and you probably all know this, and you don't need me to tell you that oftentimes county councillors are not just county councillors. They are more than that by necessity, which is my reality, is that I am a county councillor, elected rep, but I also operate in other spaces so that I can pay the bills, but also because they're the spaces that I originally have existed in for a long period of time, and I'm very reluctant to give them up. And so just to give you a flavour of what I bring with me alongside the county councillor role. So I'm a youth worker. I would always probably say that I'm a youth worker by trade. So when people say, what are you? I would say youth worker first and foremost, and then all the other things flow from there. So youth worker, I teach in further education as well. I'm been in Liberties College for a long time teaching social justice principles, which is very much related to the principles of what the PPN brings into all the spaces that it occupies. So that's within a youth and community studies course. And I'm also involved in youth consultation and engagement across Ireland and Europe as a trainer and facilitator, which is, again, a lovely, lovely place to operate, even though there's huge tension in those spaces. I've recently been in a space with young people where an emergent issue for young people nowadays as they scan across their continent is the worry, the concern, the threat of war being something that young people have to now process as something that might be real for them. But yeah, I get to spend really good quality time in spaces with young people talking about issues that matter to them, and then navigating the spaces of decision makers and policy making so that their voice can travel into those spaces. I'm also a trauma-informed practice trainer, so I deliver trauma-informed practice training, again, across the caring sector. Maybe people in the room have done the training or are aware. I'm sure it's very much featuring as a topic amongst all community organizations, and there's the lived reality of the people maybe that we're serving and working with. And then I'm involved in Bray Wanderers Football Club, so I'm their football and social responsibility officer, which means that I again get a chance to bring the football world into the community world and have a back and forth there. I do walking football every Tuesday morning with all the old guys, and it's again a wonderful, ticks all the boxes for health and well-being, but is also part of social change, which is very powerful work. So that's a kind of a little snapshot of who I am alongside the county councillor role. And I think for me, all the extra bits are added value, and I try to make sure that they find their way into how I operate in my role as well. So to just jump straight into then the PPN context, and having being aware of the PPN's existence outside of being a county councillor, when I was thinking about this tonight's contribution, I was thinking, well, first and foremost, the SPCs exist and are structured whereby PPN reps have a right to be there, are entitled to be there, are added value and a critical part of an SPC structure. And without PPN reps, an SPC cannot function well, will not achieve any of its ambitions in a way that has all the meaning that it should have. So there's something about you should be there, and you have every right to be there, and we should want you to be there. And then I guess you end up in there. So you are selected and chosen, and maybe you've had a role to play in which type of SPC you're going to find yourself upon. But you land in that space, and you might be feeling this sense of worth, which you should feel. And then you navigate your way in, and the first thing maybe, or one of the early things you meet is, what's going on here, and what are all the moving parts, and how do I get my head around it all? And one of the things that always strikes me is the acronyms of the world of local authorities, probably other sectors as well that I can say that I operate in, youth and community. And but I was doing a quick thought today in my head, and I was thinking, if I was doing SPC bingo with acronyms, what would come into my head? And why I share it is because for a rep from a PPN who is, with all the greatest intention and the capacity and experience and insight that they bring, which is of huge value, they still have to enter into an arena where all of this stuff is present. And I think that's also really important for us, for elected reps, for chairs of SPCs, for officials who service SPCs, and to maybe appreciate that some people come in and they might not know what all of these mean, and yet they are woven into the vernacular of local authority spaces, and in particular strategic policy committees. So even when I was looking at it myself, I was thinking the funny one in there of all of them, and again, people can test themselves to see how many they recognize. The ESB is in there because the ESB often gets blamed for maybe the fact that we've so many lights out in County Wicklow and issues. It's an easy one to maybe play the blame game with in many ways. FOI is in there as well as a tool for maybe challenging the systems and how they operate. But acronyms are a big part of what it means to operate in local authority space, and I just wanted to flag that up as a acknowledgement that, and if the support isn't there, if the preparation isn't there, if the space isn't created for representatives to come in and be able to say, sorry, what does that mean? Can someone explain that? And I know that even myself, that if you aren't empowered and almost supported and given permission to put the hand up and flag something, then you might be inclined to be nervous about doing that, reluctant to do it because you don't want to expose yourself as I don't understand, I don't know what that means. And if you're in a space where a lot of the talk seems to be going in and around and above your head, then you might miss opportunities to engage and contribute. And I think there's a dual responsibility there for those who are convening the meetings and those who are participating to be sure that everyone is included in a way that honors all the contributions. The other things I would say before I move into some big headliners is that the reality of an SPC is that it's a place of power, a place of influence, a place where decisions are made, a place where policies are developed which have impact. And I guess when you scan across the members of an SPC, the ideal is that you're looking at a cohort of people who, when supported to work together, will produce good policy, who, when equally supported to contribute, will scrutinize existing policy in a way that gives scope for it to get better or to be enhanced or to highlight deficits. And again, that idea of how people are supported to work together is really, really critical. And I'll talk a little bit about the power dynamics and how important it is for PPN reps also to see where they leverage power. And I think that's, again, not to be dismissed, not to be shied away from, is that when the PPN rep is sitting in an SPC, they are representing a volume of people who are voters, who are the community. And I know elected reps will claim to represent the community as well, and we do. But in your role, you're representing a formed community, which are also then rippling outwards into the broader community. And I think that gives you power that you should kind of think about how you leverage that in the space so that you can have an impact. So there's kind of three things I'd love to just chat about. And again, if it sparks conversations and questions, then brilliant. And if I haven't thought of something and someone wants to come in and probe and prompt, I'm 100% open and happy to have further conversations. And if we have questions and we don't get there in terms of answering all of them, I'm fully committed to any follow-up that might be beneficial. So when I think about the PPN in an SPC, I would say that, again, what the foundational stuff for the PPN engagement is about the principles and the values that you bring into a space. So your agenda is connected to how your PPN has formed its own thoughts and views, positions, and has structures that are open to generating views, building consultation in. So participation obviously is a big principle, and participation in an SPC means that you are there to give, and what you bring matters. I think it's really important that the inclusive dimension of SPCs as well, in that you are there giving voice to groups that may not otherwise have a voice in that room. And again, that reminder, I think, is empowering for SPCs, that if I'm sitting there as an elected rep, I'm relying on the PPN reps in many ways to bring in voices, to bring in insight, to make contributions that reflect voices, groupings, concerns, ideas that are sitting out in the community and should be channeling their way into SPC meetings. And what's really powerful for me as well, when I see PPNs in action in our SPCs, is that you take accountability seriously. You might be inclined to wonder how many politicians take accountability seriously, and it might be hard to justify I don't even know if I could push back on someone making aspersions about politicians and accountability. But I would say sincerely that I see a model whereby PPNs use accountability as a tool for their engagement. And what that looks like for me as an elected rep is that you come into meetings, and when you speak, you're speaking from a voice of who's in the background in the organizations that are represented on the PPN. I see PPNs who tell the story of their engagement in the SPC back to their members and do that in a constructive and purposeful way. I love, and I think I said this, Catherine, where a PPN rep will say, do you know what? Before we make that decision, I'd need to go back and talk to the community about that. Which again is honoring the accountability part, where sometimes an official might be in a mode whereby, or a councillor might be in a mode, let's get this done, let's get it through. And I think the community in many ways relies on the PPN to maybe slow it down a little bit. And to me, that's where, and that's because accountability is so important to the PPN. Principle to bring into SPCs is that the PPN is always open and transparent, and it demands it from others. And I think when you bring that in and when you take ownership of that as part of your role, then you also project it outwards. And I would say it has an impact on culture of SPCs when PPN reps are bringing a sense of accountability and bringing a value for transparency. Then the positive impact is that the SPC should also hold those as part of its culture. Two other things that I would share about the principles and values is the empowerment piece. And I think, and that's a really interesting one, because it's like, for me, looking over scanning across my SPC at the moment, it's very inspiring to see people there who are willing to come to meetings, to do the relevant reading in the background, to scrutinize documents, to prepare themselves for the contributions, to go away and do further consultations. And I think the empowerment piece is both important for the individual PPN reps, that they feel empowered to be there and to contribute, and that what they have to contribute is of value. Because if we have any question marks about that as participants and representatives, or if it's taken away from us, if we feel disempowered because the structure is not inclusive, or the structure isn't inviting us to contribute, or we have to use our elbows to get our say in something, if there isn't a culture of an invitation to contribute, then we have to draw on our empowerment to make sure that we are heard. And again, I've so much admiration for PPN reps who will say, can I stop you there? I think we need to just go back and look at that again, because I'm not fully sure what that means, or I'm not fully sure I get where you're coming from, or can you just say that? I think that type of stuff, or to say that I'm not sure you've heard what I've said about what the community are saying about this issue, and I don't see it represented in where we're going with this policy, et cetera, et cetera. And I think again, as I say, that the empowerment piece is really a game changer in that regard. And then the last thing before I go into some examples, I would say is again, all those principles around sustainable development and social justice. And I think that, I would say in many ways, you're the guardians of that agenda. And I hope that doesn't feel like pressure. I think it's more, I would say it's an honor in many ways, because I would consider myself a guardian of those principles as well. And the more people we have in those rooms that see themselves as guardians of sustainable development, guardians of social justice, because that means that you are deeply concerned with these issues, not just because it's part of your brief. You're deeply concerned with environmental sustainability, with equality, with community resilience, and that your inputs then are rooted in those. And I think one of the real challenges in many ways in local authorities, and I think where elected reps can fail and PPN reps will never fail, is that we sometimes are caught up in short-termism, and you're committed to long-termism, because the change that you're aspiring to, the change that you're demanding is about a whole community change, a whole county change, or a whole change within whether it's housing, whether it's environment, whether it's transport, whether it's finance, whatever SPC you're sitting on. that your approach to it, I like the term long-termism, because it also suggests that that there's scaffolding required, and that this work should benefit future generations. Often I'd say politicians are operating from a base that they want the benefit to be the next election. What's the return for me? And the closer you get to the next election, you might see a shift in how politicians operate, which might sound cynical, but I think there's truth there. Whereas I would say, if I'm seeing myself as a community rep looking into an SPC, I'd be relying on the PPN to hold the ground for the sustainability dimension, hold the ground for the sincerity of the social justice stuff. Because I think that that's critical, and really the only other thing I would say to it is that it's not plain sailing, and you might not get a reward there and then, and the wins might not always be what they should be in terms of the result or the outcome or the output. But I think when you're rooted in your commitment, then you'll keep fighting the good fight. I'd love to share a couple of examples. I haven't decided yet whether to go SPC at its best first or SPC at its worst first. I might go with, I'll go with the best, SPC at its best first. And I would say again that this is, why I'm bringing this into the space is that I really believe as well that PPN reps should have an expectation of how they're treated, how they're invited into SPC spaces, how they are supported to engage, how they are facilitated along the way. And I think that's, for me, how they are honored for what they are bringing, that it shouldn't have to be all of your work to navigate an SPC environment and to make an impact, and that you're flying solo all the time in that regard. I think there should be responsibility sitting on the other side of the house and around the house for how we make the most of that. So if I was given an example of, let's say, an SPC at its best, and I would say that even in a flow, so if I was giving you a flow of the meeting has just begun, for me, what it looks like is the chair acknowledging the PPN reps and acknowledging their unique role and acknowledging what they bring in terms of a grassroots community voice. So I think, and again, maybe not every single meeting that would happen, but I think any PPN rep who's landing in an SPC should be met with a welcome that acknowledges your unique role, acknowledges what you're bringing in terms of grassroots awareness and a community of voice and an insight. I think an SPC at its best also should be one that has documents sent in advance, but documents also made in an easy to read way, so that you should have an expectation that someone is thinking about your needs when they're sending out documents, and that you should be asking and requesting if it's not. So anyway, at its best, you will get documents, and someone will be mindfully considering that you're going to be able to understand them. I would also say that an SPC at its best would discuss draft policy positions. Let's say a housing policy draft is discussed. A PPN rep might raise concerns about how it might impact marginalized renters, let's say, or people in the community. And that's taken on board, and that influences then where the policy goes next, rather than it just being acknowledged, we accept your concerns, but we're going ahead in the way that we want to. So that an SPC that works best will take on board a PPN contribution and but invite it to influence the journey of the policy making. Because what you are raising, let's say it is concern about marginalized people who might be struggling with rent, that's real, because that's coming from your proximity to people in the community who are experiencing these things. And a good SPC would invite you to expand. A good SPC would affirm the value of that as an input. A good SPC would maybe invite further consideration of that as a topic, and allow it then to maybe influence the flow of decision making around any issues that are coming up. Again, a good SPC would consider feedback loops for PPN reps, and make offers to say that because again, we probably, anyone in this room has been, and I'll put my hand up and say, I've sat in meetings where it's just melted my brain because there's so much technical jargon, and it's a whole area. I'm on an SPC at the moment that has 7 moving parts in one SPC, 7 different departments. So there might be a topic coming in where it's totally new territory for me. And a good SPC will say, if you need extra time outside of the meeting, we'll follow up and make sure that you are supported to get your head into this stuff, and we'll be committed to doing that. A good SPC would also let and value a PPN rep saying, this decision can't be made today because we need to go back, and we'll come back to the next one with more information. I sat on an SPC in the last term whereby there was a somewhat of an expectation that a policy would land at a particular meeting and it would be ratified, and then it would go to full council in the next meeting. And because of the PPN reps on that committee, it took 3 more meetings before it went. And that's nearly 3/4 of the year, because the PPM reps said, we're not ready yet. And because of the way that they leverage their power, but also were sincere in their contributions, the elected reps and the other reps on the SPC agreed and took a lead from the PPN reps to say that, okay, that's fair enough. And every time that we took extra time, the policy got stronger, the policy got better. And when it landed at full council, every single member of the SPC was proud of what we produced collectively. And what I would add to that is that, and maybe people have had this experience, and again, I'll talk about a worst case scenario, but it's also viable for an SPC to vote something through and power play the votes, and then leave PPN reps outside of that because they don't have the means maybe to leverage votes. So again, you could say we need more time on this, and someone else might say, well, let's just get it done today. And that's worst case management of the contribution of a PPN, and you don't get good policies at the end of that type of approach. I would say then the last thing I would say about a best case SPC is that people like me, councillors, would take a proactive role in seeing how we can link with the PPN reps and support them, debrief with them, and really, again, I would say, be steered by the needs of the PPN reps in terms of how a councillor might be of support. Sometimes, again, you probably maybe experience tension with councillors who are having their own agenda, or maybe their own culture, or their own way of operating in an SPC. For me, an ideal scenario is that a councillor is an ally to the PPN rep, because we are both at face value representing the community, and our agendas should be shaped by and driven by the community's needs. And again, I'm sure you have 1,000 examples of how that's not real for councillors, and that's fair as well. So the last bits on a well-functioning SPC in terms of PPN reps is, I would say, they are respectful, they are inclusive, they are thoughtful, that the rep feels seen, that they're not just tolerated and included in a basic sense, but they are seen and valued, and that the community's voice is not just tokenistic, extra blah blah blah, but that it shapes outcomes. SPC at its worst, and again, this is horror shop stuff, but I think it's real, and I think to dismiss it or ignore it, or to do toxic positivity on SPCs for PPN reps is not helpful at all. So, I've seen and experienced meetings where reps are tokenistic, and at times intimidated by the way the culture of a committee is operating. A meeting might be starting late because the people are scrambling, intros are skipped, and a presentation is jargon heavy, and a PPN rep then is paralyzed because there is no invitation for them, or no culture, or no conditions created where they can say, sorry, can you go over that again? Or they feel if the agenda is packed out, you've only received it 3 or 4 days beforehand. Even if you did ask for more information, you wouldn't be able to consume it on time. But it seems like you're in there and most of the other people are on board and they're able to go with the flow. And so you as a PPN rep might be feeling like, why am I here? What am I going to do? How am I going to make meaning out of this? I don't want to look like I haven't a bull's notion what's going on. And even if you do put up your hand and say, sorry, we only got these 2 days ago or 3 days, whatever, and I'm not sure I'm up to speed. Can we take a step back? And maybe you get eye rolls, or maybe you get, well, you'll just get the hang of it eventually, or listen, we haven't got time to be. All of that is real and again, uncomfortable. And I think the challenge for reps is back to the empowerment piece, is to be able to hold your ground in that regard and know that you have every right in the world to say, well, I'm sorry, but it's just, I'm not sure we can continue if you're going to leave me behind in that regard. And again, hopefully it's not a prevalent scenario, but it is real in many ways. I think that one of the worst phrases in any SPC or any committee meeting is noted, but we're just going to have to move on. Because again, if that doesn't acknowledge in a meaningful way what someone has contributed, then you're going to be bashing your head against the wall. A couple of other things I would say is that if people don't, if you're on an SPC and the process hasn't been explained, if the procedures haven't been explained, if there is a voting culture in it where that's how things get moved on, if you haven't been explained about how the quorum operates, if you're wondering why there are 6 officials in the meeting and 5 elected reps, and then like a few dots of others. If that isn't explained to you, the why of that and the rationale for that, then again, you're operating in a space where you've got one hand tied behind your back. I think a really important one as well, and you see this in when policies come to full council that are created in an SPC, it should be acknowledged in the contribution at full council where the PPN contributed to the development of the policy. And again, that's not to say the PPN deserves special treatment, but the PPN's role is to bring something that others can't bring. And therefore, in my view, the PPN contribution to the policy should be acknowledged at full council, because you've also then got councils and officials and the media and the public who then start getting an awareness and appreciation that the PPN dimension of this is critical in order for us to produce a policy like this. And then I think the what's interesting is, and again, we know with local authorities how they operate, that there's a whole lot of moving parts. There's a whole momentum piece. There's stress and anxiety and deadlines and expectations inside the house. And the risk of that is that then the follow-ups are dropped. That the extra consultation is dropped, that the implementation, the story of implementation goes by the wayside, and it just goes into the machine and does its work. And then the PPN doesn't get to revisit, review, scrutinize implementation after it's put all the work into the development. I think the last thing I'd say about at its worst is, again, when people are sitting there and feel alienated, when disempowered, where I wonder, I'd love to know, maybe do a poll in the zoo, how often you're sitting in an SPC meeting and it feels like a space of performance rather than policy making. And if PPN reps feel like outsiders in a SPC, then I think an SPC is failing in its role to bring a collective together to really make a difference. And again, the final thing I would share as a huge concern and as a worst practice example is that if the PPN rep and the PPN is sitting there in name only, and that if somebody can't articulate, explain, and validate the contributions of PPN reps on an SPC, but are happy to say the PPN are there in on the website or in the narrative, then that's not good enough at all. And one more thing I'd love to share. I was thinking about how you can navigate those spaces. And I can send this on as well. I was just during the week taking notes about things that you can bring into a meeting so that your contribution and how you're operating can be a little bit on your terms, and which is again about honoring what you bring and what you contribute. And I was thinking about the things that people could say in certain scenarios that might again be constructive and valuable for PPN reps. And sometimes PPN reps have to get each other's back because there's more than one of you on an SPC at times. But I would say so. The quick examples of scenarios where a PPN rep can make a difference for themselves and their colleagues. Sometimes, you can be the one that helps to slow down or pause the pace. And again, as I said, that's like before we move on, I'd really appreciate a moment to just sit with this and let's just go through that again. Slowing down the pace, it can be really critical to good policy making. Asking for clarification or repetition, again, being able to do that. Can I just ask for that to be explained again? I'd really appreciate that. And when you're saying that from a place of sincerity, it's hard to dismiss. It's hard to for someone to steamroll through that. Deferring a decision or requesting more time, I think again is a really strong contribution that a PPN rep can make to say that given the impact of this, the scale of this, the scope of this, my view would be that this needs more time. And you're leveraging the power that you bring into the space by saying that. And I think it's a very, very useful for good policy making. Two more things I would say is that, to sometimes it's the PPN's reps' responsibility in many ways to flag an issue or to challenge a misalignment. Again, your roots are in social justice. Your roots are in, again, the honoring consultation, collaboration. And then you might be the one that has to say, there's a gap I'm seeing here. And can we just have a look at that for a moment, because I'm sensing that there's a gap and I think we might need to re-engage here, or we need to do a bit more here or there so that we can really sign off on this or own this. And then the last one I would say is that again, it might be the responsibility of a PPN rep to question a process or raise concerns about a process. And because like one of the things that I've experienced is the pace at times where you could be, drift off for a moment and a decision is made and they've moved on. And maybe you might have to say, can we revisit, or a decision was made. And again, I've had this experience as an elected rep. A decision was made outside the meeting because someone thought it was okay to do that. And then it's presented back into the meeting as done and dusted. And you might have to say, well, in the interest of my accountability as a representative, and then the accountability of this SPC, could we revisit how that decision was made, so that we can better understand how the processes work for the outcomes or the outputs. And again, you are the ones, and again, my favorite inputs from PPN reps was the community consulted about this and how? And I think, again, that's where for that to be dismissed, or for that to be, no, it's okay, we didn't need to do that, I think, again, shows something about a deficit in an SPC. And if we really want the community contribution to be valued, then the PPN reps are a big part of that. And again, I think the last thing I would say is that when I'm again, I love when a PPN rep is able to sit in a meeting and say, well, I spoke to the community of Baldinglass or the community in Blessington about this, and here's what they're saying. And to me, that's like, and it might sound like simplistic, but the power in that is making a demand of the SPC, because it's saying, I have, as the PPN rep, I've spoken to the people about this. They have given me feedback. I'm bringing that into this space. Now, what are we going to do with it? And the obligation on the SPC reps is to honor that by saying, yeah, well, you've brought something in. It's going to have an impact and an influence on what we're doing on this topic. So let's weave it in, let's bounce it off, let's find a way to include it so that it helps us to shape good policy. I'm almost listening to my own voice now, thinking I've been waffling. But I hope that, like, again, some of that has resonated a little bit with people. And from my point of view as an elected rep, like, I've really experienced how PPN reps are essential to SPCs, but I've also seen them struggle. And again, that's where my empathy flows outwards, that I've seen them bamboozled out of an agenda. And then you kind of 3 months later, they're not on the SPC anymore because they probably thought, why am I bothering with this? And someone else takes their place. And I think that's, again, a failure of an SPC. Is that okay, Catherine?
Very good, thanks. Yeah, no, I thought some of that was really rang true for me. I think the At Its Best piece really gives us a good overview of what the expectations of PPN rep should have for their SPC meeting. You were talking about, that PPN, the reps should have these expectations to be, how they're treated, how they're included, how they're involved. So I thought that, yeah, At Its Best piece, hopefully people can go in expecting that now, and if they don't get it, they can question why, and they can work towards not letting that happen. And then, ways that you can kind of not let that happen, of leveraging the power of being rep from your community, and using accountability as a tool. I thought that was really good as well. It's kind of holding the elected reps up and saying, nah, hold on. It is the community's voice, and I'm a representative of it, and we need to slow down, take your time, and make sure that the community is included. I thought that there's loads of different tips I've come across over the years of, if an SPC is being managed badly, how does it get fixed? And that's definitely one thing that could go towards it. It's definitely not on the reps completely to fix issues. You should be working with your PPN resource workers and with councillors. A lot of it, I think, is communication and building those relationships between councillors and PPN reps. You mentioned as well that PPN reps should have each other's backs, that works really well. And something I'd heard before as well from PPN resource workers and reps in the space has saying that they'd recommend just a quick meeting between the reps before the SPC, even meeting up 15 minutes before and going over what they're going to talk about. And, okay, if I raise this, will you, have my back on this issue? And just having that clear before you go in has been helpful for people. And I know some PPNs have taken that a step further and have had a kind of a coffee meetup that's open to the councillors as well beforehand. And it kind of just gives that space for those relationships to be built. And so that could be a way of inviting those problems to be sorted out. When you're sorting out problems, it is a long-term thing. But we have a few minutes for questions, and I have this poll ready to go as well. For how often do you feel that your role as a PPN rep at an SPC meeting is performative or has no impact? So if you'd like to take part in that, it might be interesting just to see how many people would feel that. And well, the first question here as well from Moira is, if policy we proposed has gone forward from the SPC, how do we find out if it has been implemented or simply shelved? So she says, as an environmental rep, council does not necessarily agree with her proposals, especially if they're proactive rather than reactive.
Great question, and I can very much relate with proposals. Not being, I probably spend my life making proposals that don't end up being accepted or get go to, I would say, sometimes the graveyard of proposals and motions. But I think I would say sometimes it's outside of the meeting where you, legitimately have the option to follow up with who is the key person in the council responsible for that. I presume all your SPCs like ours are chaired by councillors, and then within and around them are the officials whose job it is to convene and support and administer the SPC. I would say first and foremost, you can always and should always be able to ask the whoever the senior rep is in that department, and then leverage your councillor if you have councillor allies. Create an expectation of them also to do that checking in, to go and ask those questions about implementation. And the second part is very real, is that we have some phenomenal people on our SPC, and again they bring like sometimes very meaningful interpretations of where we need to go for environmental policy. And the big learning often in SPCs is how do we find a common ground that is good enough for us to bring a policy to a full council. And sometimes that means making concessions at times, or coming to a consensus that is acceptable. But I would say always put it out there. But I certainly carry within me is that when I put something out there, I'm ready for it to be reined in. I'm ready for someone to scrutinize it. I'm open to somebody maybe influencing it or reshaping it into something else. And sometimes, councils are a bit more conservative to some of the radical points of view that we might bring, because our people are in that place in the community. So it can be challenging to navigate that, and it's really about trying to commit to what end point is good enough for the time being, or what I would always to myself say that is this momentum in the right direction, or are we going off outside of the direction we should be going? If it's momentum in the right direction, then I can work with it and maybe try and push it further, push it along quicker. But it's a very real issue that things getting shelved or things being too slow in terms of implementation.
Okay.
See the other question about SPC chair refusing to put an item on the agenda for a future meeting. Yeah, that's one where again it's about I would never recommend to anyone to call someone out in live and in real time. But I think if you have suggested an agenda item and there hasn't been a good rationale for it not to be, and you've done that offside, as in an email, or you've talked to the chair and you've made a suggestion, I think we should have this agenda item. If they're unwilling to put it on in the background, then I'd be inclined to say it in the meeting, and someone will have to take ownership for that decision, which creates tension. And I know, and then we're not all built for creating and generating tension. But for me, if someone isn't is preventing an item from coming onto an agenda, then I would want a really good explanation for the why of that, so that I can tell the people who I represent why it can't be on the agenda, rather than somebody saying no and no extra information.
Okay. Just a note on that poll, I'll close it now in a minute. But if you haven't been able to figure it out, you can tap the left corner to do the poll of your screen there. It should be up there. Yes, so the next question there from Liam, isn't it important to frame contributions as policy related so that it does not get seen as operational? What are your thoughts on that, on how to frame a contribution?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I would suggest that SPCs aren't always filling agendas with policy making. But I think it's a great point to make in terms of how our contributions relate to something that is existing, something that's being developed, or something that's needed. Because I think then that just validates all the contributions. But I think at times they go off into operational land. We need a parks department, or we need more money for this or that, or we need, and we can get caught up in conversations where I know even for elected reps where there's a tension between reserved functions and executive functions, and what you don't want is someone to say, listen, that's none of your business, that's not your remit. So it's wise to, again, and there's learning there about how to navigate the space. Again, I think it's amazing when people can channel their contributions into the policy domain, because then it shouldn't ever be dismissed if it's policy related contribution.
Very good. I'm going to end that poll now, and you can have a look at the results, everyone there. Also, while you're having a look, I just want to say, if you are unable to use the chat for any reason, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question if you have a question for the night. So I don't know if you have one poor person says all the time, and there's a lot in the sometimes and often. But 3 never, so there's some positives. And then a lot of new reps as well, which is great to have you on board. So over to the next question there. Amora has a comment that she usually sends motions to the whole chain, so everyone knows it's gone in. Again, holding people accountable. Could you please give more examples about regarding effective communication that you've witnessed in meetings?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, probably the biggest hurdle to overcome is the confidence part, is that every time you speak, that you should remind yourself that you're speaking from authority, you're speaking from a legitimate place, because what you're contributing is coming from the community, is coming from the organizations that are represented in the PPN, or because of the consultations that you've done. I mean, to me, the effective communication is always looks like and sounds like someone that is prefaced, the contribution is prefaced by where it's coming from, and that also helps us to train ourselves to not go on a solo flight when it comes to engagement in the SPC. Again, it's for all of us. I think at times we're pulled into our individual thoughts or individual views or individual ideas. But for me, the effective communication in SPC meetings is, I would remind people, don't be afraid for it to be a question, in as far as it can be a contribution. I think effective communication also looks like, and the work that you do very well above and beyond anyone else on an SPC, is that it's the voice of others that you're bringing into the room. So when you're making a contribution, or if you're sharing an input from a consultation, that you're wrapping it up in the fact that this is coming from a consultation that we've done, or this is coming from my conversations with. And I think then when it's framed, when your communication is framed from where it's rooted, where it's coming from, then it's much harder for people to dismiss it. But it also adds value because it gives a context that is a strength, that good policy making is strengthened by a more collaborative, or the wider and broader the engagement, the better potential for the policy making.
Yeah, absolutely, very good. And there's another question here then. Is it good to talk privately to the chair and get his views firstly before bringing something up?
That's a great question, and a great strategy if you see the scope to build relationships. Do it, yeah. And again, with all the reps in I love the idea of even having a little coffee and a chat. And I would suggest don't dive in like in an intense way, but I think it is so worthwhile to build a connection with the chair. Invite them to come and visit wherever you're located, or into a meeting of, whether it's a PPN internal meeting or a community meeting, and you show, for want of a better way of expressing it, if you show some love to the chair, and we all know as human beings that we're inclined to reciprocate. So I think it's a brilliant idea. And I love the idea of something that maybe you don't mind if it doesn't end up on the agenda as such, but it's a great way of making that connection. What do you think about I was thinking of putting this. And then you're also saying, I value your input on this. And they might say, you know what, it's probably not. And then you're saying, oh, brilliant, really appreciate that, thanks. So the better your connection and relationship with the chair, I think it will come back to you. So I think that's a brilliant, it's very, very worthwhile. Again, not easy. Like, again, I'm not going to presume that every single chair across the island of Ireland on every SPC is open and available to building relationships and connection, but it's worth a bid, and bidding for connection is worthwhile.
Very good. There's a question here now, which might have to be our final one. How can reps feed back to linkage groups meaningfully without stepping on other SPC members' toes? For example, discussing items from meetings where minutes are not yet approved. So I know, just to fill people in who mightn't be aware of linkage groups, they're the conversation groups, the discussion groups between the reps who sit on the various committees and the wider community. So the rest of the PPN members, they can all come together and talk to the reps. The reps can tell them what's going on in the SPCs and then get the input directly from the community members at these meetings. So I don't know if you have any knowledge of that yourself, but
yeah, it's a really good point, because it can be a barrier and it could be annoying, let's be honest, that if you have to wait for minutes to be approved in order to meaningfully discuss something, or not compromise yourself by discussing something that ends up, well, wasn't captured that way in the minutes. In that context, I'm inclined to share my impressions rather than the detail of a meeting, and some of the highlights, or some of the things that have come up. If there's a basis for a conversation or a sharing that is kind of framed in a broad sense rather than a specific detail, this amount of money is going to be allocated to this thing, or this decision has been made. Yeah, if you're filtering it through, what do you think is again feasible to share in lieu of the minutes coming out? There's probably still plenty to talk about, I would say, but it is wise to and very real to consider. Yeah, until the minutes come out, that's the formal acknowledgement of what was said and done and decided at the meeting. So it's a well-made point. And in terms of virtual meetings, and it's again very real, hard to develop relationships. And I would say if you had, and maybe this is an unfair ask, but if you had the scope outside of the meetings, then to make a connection. And I know I have an SPC where I got a young person a seat on an SPC from a Corlin and Og, and I asked the team in the local authority, will you host like a cup of tea and a chat with this young person and explain everything about the SPC to them before they come in. And again, that's a nice way of going into their territory and then letting them feel like they're hosting the connection, and then it can be a building block for more connections.
Yeah, I think a lot of those relationship buildings, even if the meetings are virtual, there could be something potentially done. Maybe I don't want to put more work on the PPN resource workers, but maybe an event that invites councillors to the community members events and such like that you recommended there as well. So it's just hit 8 o'clock. Thank you everyone for being here and for listening and for your questions. And thank you, Dermot. I thought that was brilliant. It was a really good overview of kind of what to expect, and I think a lot of very valuable ways that you can kind of consider about how you actually interact with SPCs to make an impact. Whether that impact has an immediate effect or not is it's probably more a long-term project, especially if you're working with SPCs that aren't very friendly to PPN reps. But there are also there's lots of other tips and tricks on how to interact with SPCs available as well. We did a webinar in November that has some of them in it. So if I'll send out the link to that recording as well, if you want kind of additional tips and tricks. And if you have any questions or anything that you didn't get answered or occur to you afterwards, you can email me, and I'll ask Dermot, and we'll do our best to answer you. So thank you, Dermot, and thank you everyone.
Thanks a million for having me.